On Sunday eves, I'll be preaching from John, and so when I preach, we covered 1 John. We're in 2 John tonight. So if you have your Bibles, I won't be moving a lot far from the way of the text. I'm going to stick pretty close to the text each time, but I will make a few verses and stuff. I usually have them on a PowerPoint slide. John tells us that he wrote these things in order that we might believe, and that by believing in Jesus as the Son of God, we might have life in His name. So he pretty much tells us in John chapter 20, verse 31, that is his motive. That's what he wants to do. And so that's why I like John. I mean, I think it's a gospel that speaks to us. It's a little bit different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's not too worried about chronology, how the sequence of things. John just wants to get the facts out there for you, and so that you may believe in Jesus. So, Brother Chris Speck asked me a little while ago, "What are you preaching on tonight?" And I said, "We're going to preach about making wine and making whips." So that's sort of what's done in the text tonight, but making wine and making whips. So those are the two major things in the text. If you have a Bible that breaks things down. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, talks about Jesus' first miracle, the turning the water into wine. And 2, verses 12 through 24, talks about Jesus taking the cords and binding them together in the temple and using it to cleanse the temple. So we're talking about making wine and making whips. So Jesus, I'm just going to read the text to you, and then we'll go back and look at the verses in it. In preparing myself for this study, I made the decision that I would use a translation I was not familiar with that would make me read it slowly and pay more attention to it. And it was in this text today, it really brought a lot of things out to me as preparing for the lesson. But so I'm using the New Century Version. Most everywhere usually use the New King James mostly, or the NIV every once in a while. But so that's what I'm reading first. So it may read a little bit different than what you're used to hearing, but you can follow along with me. 2 days later, there was a wedding in the town of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his followers were also invited to the wedding. When all the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Jesus answered, "Dear woman, why come to me? My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you to do." In that place there were 6 stone water jars that the Jews used in the washing ceremony. Each jar held about 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled the jars up to the top. Then he said to them, "Now take some out and give it to the master of the feast." So they took the water to the master. When he tasted it, the water became wine. He did not know where the wine had come from, but the servants who brought the water knew. The master of the wedding called the bridegroom and said to him, "People always serve the best wine first. Later, after the guests have been drinking a while, they serve the cheaper wine. But you have saved the best wine till now." So in Cana of Galilee, Jesus did his first miracle. There he showed his glory, and his followers believed in him. The method by which I'm putting these sermons together is a little bit different, and it's a little bit of an approach that you've been familiar with. We've had other people here preach from this perspective, but very often I'm going to ask you questions and for things for you to contemplate and to think as we go through the text. But here was wine, and this is to the Jews was equal to joy and celebration. I've performed 6 weddings so far this year. I think that's the last one was scheduled. 3 of the weddings were outdoor weddings. On 2 of those times it rained. Okay, but weddings are fun. I mean, they're sort of fun occasions, and so much preparation goes into it. And this is not a new thing. And in fact, many of the traditions we have in wedding ceremonies and receptions are very, very old. The Jews, they had a hard life, especially they're living in an occupied land. It was really a struggle for them. But weddings were a time where people just celebrated. It was good things happening. And sometimes these wedding feasts would go on for days. They would just go on and on and on. And so, but one of the things that made the wedding somewhat a popular event was that it was open to people by invitation, and very poor people was something they could go and celebrate and enjoy. And they equated the presence of wine to being to celebration. It meant it was a time of jubilation and joy. There's many passages in Scripture, but Psalms 104 verse 15, you give us wine that makes happy our hearts, and olive oil that makes our face shine. You give us bread that gives us strength. So they equate wine to happiness. And so here we are at this wedding feast, and they've run out of wine. And that's a great concern. In fact, Jesus' mother comes to him, and I don't know, and as I was reading it, I really didn't find anything to support some of my thinking in it, so I sort of had to drop that idea. But Mary seems to be serving in a place of importance here. She's sort of getting things going, it appears. It appears like she's very aware of what's happening here. You know, if you were just a normal guest, you probably would not be aware of it, but Mary's aware that, man, they're out of wine. They didn't order enough, they didn't have enough, they didn't make enough or whatever. They're out of wine. And she goes to him and says, you know, they're out of wine. He says, but it's not my time to be revealed yet. It's not my time. And so I don't know what Mary was thinking. It's interesting here that she almost has her own identity. She's not the wife of Joseph. So perhaps Joseph is already dead. We know of no other recorded incident of Joseph after the age of 12. So maybe sometime 12, and Jesus is now probably 32, 33 years old, entering his public ministry. Joseph has died, and it appears that maybe she's a woman of some influence in the community. Now, she's gone to Cana of Galilee, which is not far from Nazareth, but nevertheless, she's over there. She appears to be, you know, all right. You go to dinners or you go to things, and there's just some women who seem to know what they're doing and know what's going on. And they're sort of organizing things. It looks like Mary's one of those, okay? And she says they're out of wine. So this is a sadness to them because they equate wine with joy. But he says, it's not my time. And maybe she thought it was his time. Because here she shows up. He's acting like a rabbi. He's actually having disciples. We read in chapter 1. He's having disciples join him. He and his disciples are invited to this wedding. Maybe she thought it was his time. Maybe she wasn't tipping too far outside because he now has his own entourage, if you will, coming with him. And maybe she's thinking it is his time because he's acting a lot in that regard. But nevertheless, she says something, which is whatever he does. Now, reflect a little bit over the life of Mary. Remember the circumstances of Jesus' birth? A young girl in a small town, pregnant and unmarried. And no, that was a challenge for her. And maybe she experienced some social ostracism. Maybe she experienced some negative things because remember Joseph struggled, and the angel had to come to Joseph and said, you know, take her to be your wife because she's never been with another man. This child is conceived by the Holy Spirit. Joseph took her with him to Bethlehem, which was sort of somewhat unusual. A woman that far along in pregnancy, you would probably not have taken them away from their home, but he took her with him to Bethlehem. And so maybe Mary had come into her own. She's had other kids and she's established, and maybe she's come into her own, and maybe out of respect to his mother, he did what he was asked to do. Now, these water pots, if you will, or these jars, were heavy stuff. This wasn't this little pottery stuff. This was carved out of stone. And when I was in Israel, saw them, they were quite large. The pots themselves were unbelievably heavy. But one reason they were made out of stone because that's where the water was stored for them to do their washing for special purposes. To get ready to go to worship, they had to have ceremonial cleansing. Before meals, they had the ceremonial cleansing. But that was the special water was kept there, if you will. Because stone was considered innately pure, where clay was considered innately dirty and had to be cleansed and purified. Stone was considered innately pure. And so these large stone pots, each holding 20 to 30 gallons of water, they fill them to the rim. Jesus just simply says, dip in. And when they dipped, it had turned into wine. Jesus is changing the old way of doing things because these kind of water pots were associated with ritualistic purity things that they're required to do under Mosaic law. And now Jesus is putting new life, if you will. If wine represent joy and life and being, Jesus is putting new life in the old jars. He's saying things are fixing to change. F.F. Bruce has this quote: Christ is changing the water of Jewish purification into the wine of the new age. No miracle that was recorded of Jesus was recorded by accident. Every one of the miracles that were chosen to tell us something. Every one of the parables chosen were chosen to tell us something about who Jesus was. Because John says, and later when we get to it, at the end of the book of John, John says, if everything Jesus had done had been written, the whole world couldn't contain the volumes. So everything was done for a purpose. John chapter 2, verse 20. The officiant, the overseer of the feast, the master of the feast says, man, people always serve the best wine first. And later, after the guests have been drinking a while, they'll serve the cheaper wine, but you have saved the best wine till now. It was apparently exceptionally good wine. It was flavorful, it was good, whatever the quality of wine. I don't know anything about wine, but whatever the quality of wine they were looking for, it was there. And he said, this is very unusual. You saved the best for last. And in John chapter 2, verse 11, it says, so in the Cana of Galilee, Jesus' first miracle, there he showed his glory, and his followers believed in him. Did they fully believe him to be the Messiah? We're not quite for sure. It appears that they believed in him as being a great man of God, because later they're going to question, are you the Messiah? But whatever happened there at that feast, they believed he was someone different. That they were close enough to see what the commands were about filling the water and dipping it out and seeing what had happened. They knew that he was different. In fact, in my review of the Bible, no one ever performed a miracle like this. No one ever taking water and turned into wine. Now, not just a little bit of wine. In fact, one Bible commentator I read talked about what this meant to this couple, because not only was it wine for the feast, but we're talking about maybe up to 180 gallons of wine were made that evening. And that would have been more than enough for the feast and enough for the couple to sell if they chose to. That this was like a great blessing in this couple. So if Jesus can turn 100 gallons of water to good wine, imagine what he can do to you. And I'm not nothing about your weight or size or anything else. It's talking about the ordinariness of water. If he can just take plain, ordinary, probably well water, and turn it into great wine, what can he do with you? What if a Christian life, or life of Christian, is like the wine at the feast? It just gets better as it goes. I think that's one of the things that Christians have on everyone else, because when things in this world begin going south, when things begin failing, when the body begins breaking, when everything else is going, because a Christian knows that the best is yet to come. It reminds me of the story, and you've probably heard it before, of the minister was called to a lady's house, and she was making specific requests regarding her end. Her end was near, and she knew it. And she wanted special songs, and she wanted certain passages read. And he said, was there anything else you'd like? And she said, yes. I want to be buried with a fork in my hand. He said, say what? She says, I know it's unusual, but I like to be buried with a fork in my hand. And he said, we'll honor that, but it doesn't make any sense to me. She said, well, I'll explain to you what that means. She said, remember all the places that you would go to eat, or maybe a special dinner, or you go out, and they would tell you as they were cleaning the table, save your fork. She said, because that always meant something good was fixing to be brought out. Some rich dessert, some decadent chocolate cake, or something else. That to save your fork meant it wasn't over yet. The best stuff was yet to come. And she says, so I want to be buried with a fork in my hand. And I want you to tell everyone why I have that fork in my hand, that the best is yet to come. And so when we look at that, and whatever spiritually is trying to be brought out to John, that his whole motive is for us to believe that Jesus can turn water to wine. Yes, definitely that. But even more than that Jesus is changing the old way into a new way, full of life and meaning, and that somehow for those who are spiritually with Christ, that the best is yet to come. And so Jesus made 1. Then Jesus made a whip. In fact, I'm going to read the text for you. John chapter 2, 12 through 24. After this, Jesus went to the town of Capernaum with his mother, brothers, and followers. There they stayed for just a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover feast, Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves. He saw others sitting at tables, exchanging different kinds of money. Jesus made a whip out of cords and forced all of them, both the sheep and the cattle, to leave the temple. He turned over the tables and scattered the money of those who were exchanging it. Then he said to those who were selling pigeons, "Take these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a place for buying and selling." When this happened, the followers remembered what was written in Scripture. My strong love for your temple completely controls me. Some of his people said to Jesus, "Show us a miracle to prove you have the right to do these things." Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will build it again in 3 days." They answered, "It took 46 years to build this temple. Do you really believe you can build it again in 3 days?" But Jesus did not mean the temple of... But what Jesus meant was the temple, his own body. After Jesus was raised from the dead, his followers remembered that Jesus had said this. Then they believed the Scripture and the words Jesus had said. When Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Passover feast, many people believed in him because they saw the miracles he did. But Jesus did not believe in them because he knew them all. He did not need anyone to tell him about people because he knew what was in people's minds. John chapter 2, verse 15, Jesus made a whip of cords and forced them all out. Sheep, cattle, people. They went scattering. Sometimes we have a hard time imagining Jesus getting mad. We have this sort of Jesus meek and gentle, the person who asked little children to sit in his lap. That's the image of Jesus. But there's many passages of Scriptures where Jesus, is roused with anger. When Jesus doesn't mince words, he calls the Pharisees a bunch of snakes. I mean, Jesus had the capacity to get very angry, but not sin. You see, Jesus was very upset by this. I remember as a child in church, the elders of our church at that time, when it come time of the year for us to sell things for schools like that, they prohibited from any selling inside the building. You could sell on the porch, the stoop, the sidewalk, but you couldn't bring and sell anything into church because of this passage. They believed that you just shouldn't do commerce inside a church and stuff. And if a farmer owed another farmer money, they would take care of it outside on the stoop, but they wouldn't bring and give each other money or whatever inside the building because of this passage. Just sort of having a reverence for the house of God. And so Jesus said, "You're turning my Father's house into a place for buying and for selling." He says, this is not what God meant for this. I guess we can sort of speculate and wonder, why did this upset Jesus so much? Why was he bothered by this so much? The temple was a big place. It had courts and courtyards and places where people were not necessarily, like the men went to a certain court and women went to another court and men could go in the temple. There was a court for John. It was a big place. In fact, during this time of the year, one of the commentators said that the number of people in Jerusalem would swell to over 1 million people. Even at that point in time, that was how big Passover was. It would be so crowded you could hardly find a place to get through the streets. It would be so crowded at that point in time. So there's a lot of people here. And Jesus is very moved with anger. There's an interesting thing here that Jesus specifically addresses those who've had the pigeons. Why is it important in talking to the guys who sell the pigeons? Now, part of the reason you had to have the money changers is that you couldn't take money that was non-Jewish into the temple and put in the treasury. So you couldn't take money that had Caesar's image on it or anything like that, because anything that was graven like that, it was considered forbidden. So if you had other currency, you had to have it exchanged. And exchange rates are very high. I mean, if you go to exchange currency today, you usually pay a little fee or whatever. But they would charge sometimes 2 or 3 days' wages just to exchange currency. Sometimes it was exorbitant, the fees that were charged. But also, people traveling great distances couldn't haul animals with them to make sacrifice. So they brought the sacrifices in, and they could buy them on the spot and take them to the priest and have them slaughtered for their sacrifice. But the pigeon sellers, why was the pigeon seller so important to him? You see, the pigeons were for the poorest of people who couldn't afford a lamb or a goat or an ox. They were for the poor people. And they would go buy their pigeons, and they were being exploited as well as everyone else. And so, in fact, if you look back in Luke chapter 2, verse 24, Jesus' parents actually had either pigeons or doves sacrificed for him soon after his birth, and according to the law at that point in time, is what the poorest of people had. And Jesus saw people just wanting to come worship God and get close to God and acknowledging Him, and they were being taken advantage of and exploited in His Father's house. But remember in John chapter 1, where was Jesus from the beginning of time? Who was the beginning? He's in the beginning with God, and He was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He was everything was made by Him, through Him, for Him. So Jesus had seen it all. Jesus has seen it all. Now, the temple that they're in now is not the one that Solomon built. That one had been destroyed. This had been rebuilt in the days of Nehemiah. We read about this morning, or Bible in our lesson this morning. This is the temple been rebuilt. It took 46 years to build it. But Jesus, remember when that temple was dedicated, Solomon's temple. In fact, Jesus will remember, how His love for the temple was. In fact, John chapter 2, verse 17, when this happened, the followers remembered that was written in Scriptures, my strong love for you, for your temple completely controls me. Now, what's interesting, this was written in Psalms. Psalm 69, verse 9. My strong love for your temple completely controls me. When people insult you, it hurts me. That's the contemporary English version. That's an interesting concept there. The word completely controls me. I think that the other translation says consume. Anyone looking at other consumes me? Yeah. It's sort of an interesting word. In fact, the word consume or completely controls means to eat up. It's the same Hebrew word that's translated to Greek. Means to eat up. It completely eats me up. Have you ever been eat up by something? Yeah. Just eats me up. And that's sort of the concept. I'm just eat up by it. And I wonder what Jesus would look at us and say, have we ever been completely eaten up by our love for the Lord, for His church? Could that be reflected on any of it, that we're just consumed by it? And that's what Jesus is making the point here, that He is consumed by His love for the Lord. In fact, what made Jesus so angry? I believe it's going back to, they had lost the holiness of the temple. This was God's presence. They had lost it. And making reference to it earlier, Jesus, remember in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10 to 11, that when they dedicated the temple, when the priest left the holy place, a cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priest could not continue the work because the temple was filled with the glory of the Lord. This is where God showed up. And they turned it into a place of commerce, and they turned it into a stockyard, if you will. Now, I've had people from Cookeville ask me, why is there a stockyard in the middle of all those restaurants in Cookeville? Because on a Friday night, it's not very apt. There used to be a steakhouse across the stockyard. And I said that was a mistake. Made it over there at the steakhouse. But you big whiff the stockyard on a Saturday night? People. And I said, hey, when they put the stockyard, that was the country. They were there first. Everyone else came in around them. That was almost nothing out there for a long time. Just Tasty Freeze, and that was across the way there. But can you imagine the temple? It's been turned into a stockyard, a mini mall, if you will. It was no longer a place of holiness and reverence. It was no longer a place dedicated on approaching God, but simply making it easy for people to approach God and taking advantage of it in the process. You see, motives have changed. Jesus was angry because that had changed what the place had meant to be. What was ironic is that they showed such profane attitudes toward the temple. And they asked for a sign. And when Jesus says, destroy this temple, they are enraged. They were angry. They said, you got to be kidding. It took 46 years. You can't do this in 3 days. They were so focused they couldn't understand what he was saying. In fact, that Jesus' disciples, John has sort of parenthetical expression, says they remembered what he said about the temple then. And they believed the Scriptures. They didn't fully understand what Jesus was saying here. But they were nevertheless indignant that he suggested that the temple they had profaned and treated so callously could be destroyed. They couldn't even imagine. It was beyond their comprehension what he was talking about. John says parenthetically there that it's not the physical temple, it's his body. His body he's talking about. Destroy it and it'll come back in 3 days. They couldn't even contemplate it. In fact, if they couldn't contemplate, I think sometimes we have a hard time imagining what he's going to do to our temple. Paul uses that reference to our bodies in 1 Corinthians. What's it going to be like? What's it going to be transformed into? I want hair again. I want to be skinnier. If I could give my preferences. But I really think of whatever it is, that it's going to be great, whatever it is, because it's God's work. And from Genesis, we know that God's work is good. John 2, verse 23. When Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Passover feast, many people believed in him because they saw the miracles he did. You see, Jesus and John are about the same thing. It's bringing people to a point of belief, accepting him as Messiah, the Son of God. Then we have this interesting thing, and I will say that until I read it in the text, I thought, man, I'd never really paid a lot of attention to that before. That they believed in him, but he didn't believe in them. They believed in him because of the miracles. But they didn't believe in him just because of who he said he was, maybe, or because of the prophecies, or because of the Scriptures. But they believed in him because of the miracles. But he didn't necessarily believe in them. He did not need anyone to tell him about the people, John says, because he knew what was in the people's minds. Jesus will give a parable about the wheat and the tares, and how a man's enemies came in and slipped in and sowed tares, things that are weeds really that look like wheat. And you can't tell the difference between two. They get to a certain point of development, and then it's almost too late. And so the servants came to the master and said, do you want us to pull the tares up with the wheat? Jesus says, no, don't do that now, because if you do that, you'll damage the wheat. But let it go to harvest. And harvest will separate the truth from the false, the wheat from the tares. It's even here that Jesus recognizes there's people coming in, people believing in him that really aren't kingdom material. They're just believing him because of the things he does, or because of the miracles or whatever, but not because they truly have the heart for God. And so people believed in him, but he did not believe in them because he knew what was on their minds. We talked sometime this morning, for a little while this morning, about Judas in the Gospel of Mark, and how, what was Judas' motivation? What was he doing? Jesus knew the hearts and minds of every man and every woman. They believed in him, but didn't always believe in them. And I guess to sort of bring things to close now, that Jesus made whips and Jesus made wine, but Jesus also knew the minds of the people. And so what does Jesus know about your mind? When he searches your mind, what does he find? Does he find a heart that really loves the things that he loves? Does he find a heart and mind that's dedicated to God? Or is it like in that man in the book of James, that double-minded man that's unstable in all his ways? Jesus is revealed in the Gospel of John in order that we might believe and accept Him and be His follower and be His child. If there's anyone here tonight, if you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we're going to stand and sing a song as opportunity to respond. If you're subject, once it comes, we stand and sing a song.